אנחנו מוצאים את הפורום זרה שמשון.
האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה? מה? כן.
Erev Tov, good evening, everyone. We're in the Zera Shimshon on Parsha Matot. This Shabbos, God willing, we're going to read the double Parsha Matot Maseh. So we're going to look at section 4, that's Os Dalid, in the Zera Shimshon on Parsha Matot. And in order to begin correctly, we're going to take a look at two psukim at the beginning of the Parsha. No, I'm sorry, not two psukim at the beginning of the Parsha, two psukim from Parsha Matot. This is Perek Lamed Aleph, Psukim Aleph and Beis. Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, and Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, Nikom nikmas b'nei Yisrael. Take the vengeance of b'nei Yisrael, me'es hamidyonim, from the Midyanim, meaning take vengeance, wreak vengeance upon the Midyanim, the Midianites, achar te'asef el amecha. And afterwards you will be gathered to your people. The expression to be gathered to one's people is an expression used in the Torah to refer to one's passing from this world, to one's death. So after, Hashem says to Moshe, after you lead the war of vengeance against the Midianites, you're going to be gathered to your people, meaning you're going to die. Doesn't necessarily mean immediately after the second the war is over, but it means that this is a step connected to Moshe's ultimate demise. Let's get right into the Zera Shimshon, Os Dalid, Medrash Yalkut. The Medrash Yalkut Shimoni, al pasuk achar te'asef el amecha, on the pasuk that we just read, after the war against the Midianites, you will be gathered to your people. Omar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Medrash, so the Yalkut Shimoni says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe, Im ata rotze lachyo shanim harbe. If you, Moshe, would like to live many years, Moshe, if you want to live many years longer, lo yiru Yisrael nekama be'oivehem, then Bnei Yisrael will not see the vengeance against their enemies. V'lo tichbash Midyan lifneihem, and the nation of Midyan, the Midianites, will not be conquered in front of them. So it's almost as if Hashem, according to the Yalkut Shimoni, it's almost as if Hashem said, Moshe, you can live for a longer period of time, but you need to know if that happens, then Bnei Yisrael will not be able to take vengeance against their enemies, and also they will not be able to conquer Midian. Miyad Amar Moshe, immediately Moshe said, Mutav shetichbash Midian lifneihem. It is better, it is to be preferred that Midian will be conquered, that the Midianites will be conquered in front of them. V'yiru Yisrael mapola bisonehem, and Bnei Yisrael should see the downfall of their enemies. So Moshe did not want to extend his own lifespan, but at the expense of pushing off the war against the Midianites, the attack against the Midianites, and also the downfall of other enemies of the Jewish people. Ad kan l'shono, until here is a quote from the Yalkut Shimoni. Yesh l'daktek, we need to question or to analyze, ma inyan Moshe im milchamas Midian. What is the connection between Moshe, and here it means specifically Moshe being alive, Moshe staying alive, and the war against Midian? What was the connection that Hashem said they're not going to be able to fight and defeat Midian, Moshe, if you prolong your life? Only if you're going to die soon afterwards will they be able to attack Midian. The Yesh Lomar, bottom paragraph, and we can say Shekosvu Hamikubolim, the Kabbalists wrote, Shekol Melech Osar, every king or leader, Shebolasos Nekama, who comes to take vengeance, Be'ezo Uma, with a specific nation. We're now at the top of the second column. Any leader or king of the Jewish people who comes to take vengeance against a specific nation, Sarich sheyiyeh lo ezeh chibur v'kishur, there needs to be some connection and bond to him, to this leader or king, im osa ha'uma, with that nation. Kigon, for example, Pinchas sheba mibenos Putiel, Pinchas, who came from the daughters of Putiel. That's something we talked about on Parshas Pinchas. Pinchas's father Elazar, the son of Aaron, the Kohen Gadol, Elazar married a daughter, or possibly a granddaughter, of Yisro, and Putiel was one of the names of Yisro. And Pinchas, who came from that lineage, on his maternal side, there was a lineage going back to Yisro, who was as the Torah tells us, who was the Kohen Midian, who was a leader, a chieftain in the nation of Midian, of the Midianites, also Nekama b'Midian. He took revenge against Midian. And that's one example. David Sheba Merus HaMoaviyah, David HaMelech, whose lineage came from Rus, the famous Rus that we read about on Shavuos in Megillas Rus, who came from the nation of Moab. Also, Nekama b'Moab. David HaMelech took vengeance against the people of Moab. V'Yehoshua shehaya mizera Yosef, and Yehoshua, this is of course the famous Yehoshua ben Nun, the disciple of Moshe Rabbeinu, who took over leadership of the Jewish people after Moshe's death. That Yehoshua shehaya mizera Yosef, who was from the children of Yosef. Yehoshua himself was from the tribe of Ephraim, and we know that Menashe and Ephraim were the two sons of Yosef. So Yehoshua came from Yosef's lineage. Shenis Gadel bebeis Potiphar, and Yosef grew up in the house of Potiphar. V'hoya osid lios chosno shel sitra achra, and this Yehoshua, who had the connection to Yosef, also was destined to become the son-in-law of the Sitra Achra, of the Yetzer Hara, which we'll have to come back to that expression in a moment. Shelokach Rochav Hazona. Yoshua married a woman named Rochav, the Hazona, which either means the prostitute or it can mean the innkeeper. And that she is a woman who appears in the beginning of Sefer Yehoshua, and she rescues she saves and protects the spies that Yoshua sends into the land before Bnei Yisrael enter the land. So Yoshua, she converted, Chazal tell us, and Yoshua married her. Vehi Yodaz Zos, and she knew this. Also Milchama be'Amalek. Yehoshua, led a battle against Amalek. So let's pause for a moment. A couple things before we go further. We're kind of stopping in the middle of a point that the Zera Shimshon's making, but let's just pause for a moment, right? So we don't lose track. So Yehoshua, the Zera Shimshon tells us, and the Zera Shimshon's whole point that he's developing here is that great leaders of Bnei Yisrael led battles against enemy nations that they had some connection to. And he gave the example of Pinchas, and he gave the example of David HaMelech, and now he's giving the example of Yoshua, and he's saying Yoshua had a connection to Amalek, and that's why he led a battle against Amalek. Okay, how did Yoshua have a connection against Amalek? We haven't totally explained that yet, but first of all, Yoshua comes from Yosef, and Yosef, of course, has a connection to Mitzrayim. Now, Yoshua also marries Rochav Hazona, Rochav, the prostitute or the innkeeper, who becomes the son-in-law of the Yetzer Hara, so to speak, because the Gemara tells us that Rochav was an extraordinarily beautiful and lust-inducing woman. So Yoshua chose to marry a woman that was almost like marrying into the family of the Yetzer Hara. Of course, he was a tremendous tzaddik, and he was able to control his lusts and lead a sanctified and holy family and marriage relationship. So let's continue. De Amalek ubilam gematria b'Mitzrayim. If you take the numerical value of the word Amalek and the word Bilam, it will equal the word b'Mitzrayim, in Egypt. Again, the gematria, the numerical value of the word Amalek and the word Bilam, take those two values and put them together, combine them, and you will equal the numerical value of the word b'Mitzrayim, in Egypt. Because b'Mitzrayim ba Bilam b'koach Amalek. Bilam came to Mitzrayim with the strength of Amalek, litein eitza leparo, to give advice to Paro. What was the advice? Bilam gave the advice for Paro to kill the male children of the Jewish people. The Gemara Chazal teach us, as you see the references here from Maseches Sota, coming up in a moment. Shlosha hayu ba'osa eitza. There were three people that Paro asked advice from about what to do about the Jewish people that were growing stronger and multiplying at a tremendous rate. One of the three people that Gemara tells us was Bilam, and Bilam was the one who said, I'll tell you what you should do. You should make a decree, a proclamation to kill the male children of the Jewish people. So Bilam is where that came from. Vikan, and here, Vayovo Amalek, we have a pasuk that says, this is going back to Sefer Shmos, Amalek came to attack Bnei Yisrael right after they left Mitzrayim. Mehechan ba, from where did they come? From where did Amalek come? Amru zichronim levracha. So Chazal say in the Medrash, ba me'etzel Bilam harasha. Amalek came from consulting with Bilam. So Amalek and Bilam have a connection between themselves. They have a connection with Mitzrayim, as we saw from the Gematria and from the story of Bilam giving the advice about killing the Jewish babies. The Amalek who rosh leklipos, and Amalek is the head of the impure forces of the world. She'achar shekavsho Sichon ve'og, after Bnei Yisrael conquered Sichon and Og, the two nations, two powerful nations, v'hoyu lohem likones be'eretz Yisrael, and after those battles, they were prepared to enter Eretz Yisrael. Ksiv, it's written, and this comes from Parshas Bolak. This is a quote from words that Bilam said, Reishis Goyim Amalek. Amalek is the head of the nations, and the Ad Kan Lashono until here ends the quote that the Zera Shimshon's been presenting to us, and that Reishis Goyim, the head of the nations, means the head of the impure forces in the world. So if we pause to understand the whole last point that the Zera Shimshon was making, he has brought Yehoshua as another example of the fact that a leader of Bnei Yisrael, in Bnei Yisrael, if they're going to fight against an enemy nation, they have to have some kind of connection, some tie, some bond, some connection to that nation. So Yehoshua, who led a battle against Amalek, has to have a connection to Amalek, and his connection to Amalek comes as we look back and we see Yehoshua's lineage to Yosef, and Yosef to Mitzrayim, and Amalek's connection to Bilam, and Bilam's connection to Mitzrayim. So it's a little bit roundabout, but we get to the point when we see that Yoshua had a connection to Amalek, somewhat indirect, and that's why he led the battle against them. This is a idea that the Zera Shimshon says is brought down. It's a Kabbalistic idea brought down by the Mikubalim. So far, he hasn't explained why this idea should be helpful to us in understanding the Yalkut Shimoni that he started with, but of course, he's going to get there. Let's continue. Aval tzrichem anu limodai, but we need to become knowledgeable. Mahu hatam shetzorich, what is the reason of this necessity, shezeh hamelech o hasar, that the king or the leader, yelo chiborim osa ha'uma, needs to have some kind of connection to the nation, she'osa nekama, that he's going to take revenge against or fight against and attack. Why is that true? The Mekubalim said it's true, but why should it be true? The Yesh Lomar De'isa B'Shulchan Aruch or Achayim, the Zera Shimshon says, let's take a look at the halach in the Shulchan Aruch, an section of Or Achayim. Says as follows: Tashmishe Kedusha, articles that are used to hold or protect items of holiness, kigon, for example, tik shel tefillin, a person's tefillin bag, mezuzos, the case that a mezuzah scroll is in, visvarim, and a cover that's put on a sefer. Yesh lahen kedusha. When we say svarim there, we mean a sefer Torah, so the container that holds the sefer Torah. Yesh lahen kedusha. These items have holiness. So it's not just the sefer Torah itself, the scroll itself, or the mezuzah scroll, or the tefillin themselves that have kedusha, but even the bags and the containers that hold these items have kedusha. They're called tashmishe kedusha. Vitzorich legonzon. And if they become old and worn out to the point that you can't use them anymore, then you can't throw them away in the garbage. You have to do geniza. You have to store them away in a respectful and appropriate way, as you would with an old, worn-out mezuzah scroll or an old pair of tefillin that's no longer kosher, or an old sefer Torah, again, that can't be used, can't be repaired. You have to do geniza. You have to either bury them in a Jewish cemetery with certain types of specific procedures, or you have to do geniza in a different way. The Od Sham, and it also says over there in that piece in Shulchan Aruch, the Aron Habonoi Bechoma. If a person builds an aron, a kind of box or space to hold a sefer Torah, but the space already existed in the wall. So you have a wall, and you have a section of the wall that you realize, hey, if I put a sefer Torah here, I can maybe do a little more work, and it'll be like creating an aron that's already built into the wall. So it says, im hasvarim miskalkalin bo. If the Sifrei Torah that are put there deteriorate, it's not good for them. They something about that space, something about putting the Sifrei Torah in this kind of jury-rigged space is not good for them, and they start to deteriorate there. Ein bo kedusha. Then that spot does not have the holiness that an Aron Kodesh would have. Upirish HaMagen Avram, and the Magen Avram, the great commentary, one of the great commentaries in the Shulchan Aruch, explains De lo chola alav kedusha me'ikara. This spot never had holiness begin to take effect on it. De lo mikre tashmish didei, because this spot is not considered or not called a something being used in to hold or protect the Sefer Torah. Elemazik didei, it's damaging the Sefer Torah. So when you have a situation like that, then that container, that space or spot that holds the Torah doesn't have kedusha. Doesn't have the kedusha you might expect it to have because the Torah was put there. But no, it's not. It doesn't work because it is actually damaging the Torah for the Torah to be placed there. Ad kan l'shono, until here is a quote from the Shulchan Aruch. V'hine noda lechochmei ha'emes. It is known to the scholars of truth, shekol haneshamos hakedoshos mitechila, all of the holy neshamos from the beginning, hayu biyad haklipos, were in the hands of, under the control, or in the hands of impure forces. V'chein hu omer, and so the pasuk says, this is a pasuk from Eov, mi yitain tohor mitame. Who can give something pure from something tameh? Who can do that? That pasuk, according to the way it's understood here, answers who can do that. Who can take something pure from something impure? Only Hashem. Kigon Avraham miterach. For example, Avraham came from Terach. Terach was tameh, was impure, and Avraham, who was tahor and pure, came from Terach, v'chule, etc. V'chein David hoya b'Moav. And so too David had his lineage come down, as mentioned previously, from Rus, the Moabite. Dichsiv, as the pasuk in Tehillim says, Matsasi David Avdi. A pasuk in Tehillim says, I have found David my servant. Let's continue to the next page. Heichon Mitzasiv. So the Medrash asks, where? What does it mean? The Hashem says, I found David. Where did you find David? And it answers, Bisidom. I found David in Sidom, which was a reference to the nation of Moab, and David descended, of course, from Rus, and that's where David was found. Hashem found David, meaning he found David's roots amongst the nation of Moab, where Rus came from. V'chein Pinchas bami benos Putiel, and also we've already mentioned how Pinchas came from, has a lineage on his maternal side from Yisro. V'chein Yehoshua bami Yosef, and Yehoshua came from Yosef, as we've mentioned, Shelokach Osnas bas Potiphera, who married Osnas, the daughter of Potiphera. So in each of these cases, we see that great, extraordinary spiritual leaders and leaders of the Jewish people came in these cases from a lineage that had serious klipa, serious impurity to it, whether it was Moab in the case of David, Yisro, and then which is Midian in the case of Pinchas, and Mitzrayim in the case of Yehoshua. Ve'od hayamuchan lekabel rochav hazona, and Yehoshua was also prepared to receive rochav hazona, as we said before he married her, letashlim chatzi gufo, to complete half of his body, means marrying Rochav completed a unit of Yehoshua with Rochav. The dakar below nukva, because a man without a woman, poli gufa, is like half of a body. So by marrying Rochav, Yehoshua was completing himself, and he was creating a unit that you could refer to, a man and a wife as a unit, as Yehoshua and Rochav. So all of these things show us that in these cases there was a klipa, an impure force, an impure connection in the lineage of each of these leaders. V'im kain hoyasalka datach, and if so, you might think shekamosha kodem hotzos hanitzotzos hakedushos menaklipos. You might think that before the sparks of holiness could be were removed, were taken away from their outer impure shells, lo hutar lanu lasos milchama im osa ha'uma, then it should not be permissible for the Jewish people to make a war against that nation where these holy sparks are presently abiding. Kemoshe nitztaveh Moshe, for example, Moshe was commanded, shelo lasos milchama im Ammon u'Moav. Hashem told Moshe, do not make a war against Ammon and Moab. Those are two nations that came from the relationship that Lot had with his two daughters. And Hashem said, don't attack them. Bishvil shtei predos tovo she'osid lahotzi mehem, because of the two wonderful fledglings that are destined to come from them. Rus, of course, came from Moab, and a wife of Shlomo HaMelech came from Ammon. So therefore, Hashem said to Moshe, don't attack these nations. I have plans for these nations. There are special, extraordinarily special individuals coming from these nations, so don't attack them and don't wipe them out. Kach la'achra hotzos afredos tovos, after the treasured women came out, you might think that still it would be forbidden to do a war against these nations, because these nations perhaps should be viewed like a box or a tefillin container, a tefillin bag, for the sparks of kedusha shahayu betocham, which were once among them. V'yesh lahem hadin shel tashmishe kedusha shetu'unin geniza. And you might think that we have to treat these nations, in this case Moab and Ammon, for all future times, even after the time of Rus and after the time of the woman who married Shlomo HaMelech, who came from Ammon. Even after that, we have to never attack we can never attack these nations, you might think, because they are tashmishe kedusha. They protected and preserved these special holy individuals. But from another perspective, you might say, since these holy sparks, these individuals with holy sparks, became deteriorated or were damaged among them, lo nikru me'olam tashmishe kedusha, then we would never call these nations protectors of kedusha, elamazik lekedusha. They harmed the holiness of these special individuals. For Rus, all the time, the idea would be that all the time she was amongst the Moab nation before she converted and joined Naomi and joined the Jewish people. All of that time, we would think it's obvious that the culture and the society and the people of Moab brought her down. They did nothing to preserve her spirituality or to increase her spirituality. She had to fight against all of the mores and the customs of and practices of Moab in order to simply maintain her holiness. So therefore, they're mazik kedusha. The Moab damages someone's kedusha. Same thing with Ammon. And furthermore, these nations prevented these holy individuals from coming into the world beforehand. Meaning, had Rus originally been part of the Jewish people, there would have been no challenge, nothing preventing her from bringing all of her kedusha and holiness to the surface. But she was part of Moab. And all kinds of things had to happen to free her from the impurity of Moab and bring her into the kedusha and the holiness of the Jewish people. But who can prove? How do we know that the impure nation did damage to the holy individual among them? Dilma shamra oso kiraoi. Perhaps in certain cases, the impure nation actually did protect and preserve the holy spark, the holy individual that was among them. Now the Zera Shimshon begins to tie all the pieces together. Lochein, bottom of the first column. Lochein sarich, therefore it's necessary, shedafka oso hanitzotz, specifically the holy individual who came from some connection with an impure source, yinkom min ha'uma hahi, he has to lead the fight and the battle against that nation. Because that spark, that holy individual knows the damage that the impure nation wanted to do to him. Or perhaps by being a part of this impure, by having a connection to this impure nation or group, it prevented the person from doing the mitzvos appropriate until the person was freed. And now the Zera Shimshon is going to bring in another excerpt from the Shulchan Aruch. This time it's from the section of Choshen Mishpat. Shahamazik maman chaveiro. Let's say a person damages the property of his friend. Ve'ein yodua mahezik, and he doesn't know. It is not known what damage was done. Hanizuk nishpa v'notel. The victim is able to swear as to what the amount of the damage was, v'notel, and he gets to take that amount from the damager. Ketzad, for example, here's a case that expresses that halacha. Hareisha lokach kli sosa mechavero. Let's say a person took a closed vessel from his friend, v'hitilo layam, and he threw it into the ocean. Osorfo ba'esh, or he burned it in fire. So he takes a closed utensil, item, article, not knowing what's inside of it, and he throws it into the ocean or burns it. Viton hanizuk shahoye mole margolios. And now the victim says, what did you do? Inside of that little case were precious jewels, were pearls and precious jewels. Uchiyotze, or similar other high-value items. Ne'eman, the Shulchan Aruch says, the victim is believed to describe which articles were inside of the closed container that the damager wasn't aware of, that the damager couldn't speak to. The damager didn't know what was in there. Aval im oso hanitzutz lo yaseh milchama beoso ha'uma. Let's imagine that the holy individual that either came from an impure nation or had some connection to an impure nation or source, let's say that that person does not choose to go to battle be'osa uma against that nation. Im kain, if so, zehu siman shelo kibel shum nezek mehaklipa. If so, that's a sign that the person did not receive any damage from the impure source. The hador shel oso hanitzutz, in the generation of that holy spark, o hatzadik, or the righteous individual himself or herself, eino yochol limko meosa uma. They're not able to take any kind of vengeance from the nation in the future, mipnei she'adarabo, because just the opposite. Osta tov lador hazeh. Apparently, it would look like the impure nation did something good for that generation, that they only came into the world at that time. And if the individual has no interest in saying anything negative about the impure source or impure nation, then it would look like the impure source didn't do any damage. And therefore the foreign nation can be considered like a tefillin bag or an Aaron HaKodesh, Shehem Tashmishe Kedusha, which actually have their own holiness because they protect items of holiness. V'raya al zeh, and there's a proof to this, Sha'arei Anitzot lo tova klum, because the holy spark that came didn't make any claims, didn't make allegations against them. Ubekan min adin hoyishe Yisrael yasu nekama b'Midyan. And here in our case, going back to our case of a battle against Midian, it would seem logical and make perfect sense and be justified for the Jewish people to attack Midian lefi ma shehechtium, because the nation of Midian seduced them into sinning in the episode of Baal Peor at the end of Parshas Bolak. Ella lefishem Moshe nisgadel sham, since Moshe grew up in the household of Yisro among the people of Midian, v'nosa isha sham, and he married a woman there. This war needed to be done through Moshe. The Bnei Yisrael had a justified claim, but they could not act on it. They could not attack Midian unless Moshe led the battle. In order to demonstrate that the Midianites do not have the status of protectors of holiness, the Moshe kodem, and if Moshe had died before, let's imagine Moshe died before Bnei Yisrael carried out an attack against Midian, then the Bnei Yisrael would not have been able any longer to take vengeance against them. And because of this, Amar Hakosov, the pasuk says, Nikom nikmas b'nei Yisrael, achar te'asef el amecha. This is the pasuk, of course, that we read in the very beginning. Hashem said to Moshe, take the vengeance of b'nei Yisrael, lead them in battle, send them out in battle against Midian, and afterwards you will die. Why did Hashem say that? Because after you die, Moshe, ein makam liYisrael litol nekama mehem. Bnei Yisrael will not be able to take vengeance from them. So we've just before we read the final paragraph, which actually is going to be the Zera Shimshon telling us a question that he's not going to discuss now. So let's pause for a moment before we read what he's not going to talk about. We've gone through a lot of steps to go in a big circle to come back to the original point. The original question was, why did the Yalkut Shimoni seem to say that there's a connection between Moshe and Moshe staying alive, or versus Moshe's death and the fight against Midian? What connection is there between those things? And so the Zera Shimshon has explained to us, has developed ideas about leaders of Bnei Yisrael having to have certain connections with impure nations in order to lead battles against them. He led up to the point of saying, as he just did in this paragraph, Moshe was the only one who could lead the battle against Midian because he had grown up there and he had lived in the house of Yisro amongst the Midianites. He had married a Midianite woman, Yisro's daughter, and only he could come and say, this is a nation that needs to be attacked. They are not Tashmishe Kedusha. They're not protectors of holiness. They didn't protect me, but rather they were a negative force against my development of Kedusha, of holiness. Now let's go to the last paragraph, the concluding paragraph. Aladayin kasha loshana medrash. But there still is a different problem in the language of this medrash, hanizkar la'el, which we mentioned previously in the very beginning. The Omar, because it stated Moshe hayirotze lachios harbe. It's the medrash stated, the Yalkut Shimoni stated that if Moshe wanted to live many years, lo haya efshar li Yisrael litol nikmosam ela ad samach lemisasel shel Moshe. Then Bnei Yisrael could not take revenge against certain enemy nations unless it was near the time of the death of Moshe. And this certainly requires explanation. Why is this true? And what was this stated about? So the Zera Shimshon says we need to go back and understand the whole other statement that was made in the Yalkut Shimoni. Omnam, however, Bamesh and Nichtov Bechidush Haba, with those ideas that we write in our next piece, meaning Os Hey, Yuvan Shapir Vidok. This will be understood correctly and precisely. V'ayinod l'komen b'Parshas Ha'azino, and you can also look on my commentary in Parshas Ha'azino. The Zera Shimshon says be'inyan Gog Magog, regarding the topic of Gog Magog, and God willing, both of those pieces we'll look at a future point. Yasher Koch for joining us in the learning of the Zera Shimshon tonight. We look forward to learning Zera Shimshon together, God willing, next week.